So in the Middle Ages, most work happened in the home, and both sexes worked. It's a mistake to imagine that women only entered the workplace, or women only worked from the mid 20th century onward. In fact, that pretty much has it backwards. Almost all women, apart from very, very, very aristocratic ones, worked in pre-modern England, because most work happened in farmhouses and in artisan, in the house, in what historians call a productive household. So that might have been a couple and possibly extended family members as well, producing subsistence goods for the family, possibly producing artisan goods for sale, possibly producing goods for use within the family. So in a farmstead situation, that might be the men producing raw materials and the women processing those into fabric or food or other goods for the family. And a huge amount of that just happened in the home, and women who were mothers would have done that with kids underfoot, and the kids would have chipped in as well the moment they were old enough to do it. So that's the sort of pre-modern template for a productive household. But when you think about what happens when so much of that work industrializes, it changed things radically, and particularly for women. I've taken the example of textile making because for tens of thousands of years prior to the Industrial Revolution, that was always women's work. And there are historians who've looked at textile making, throughout the millennia, and argued that it's historically been women's work because it can be, you can raise a loom off the ground so it doesn't your baby doesn't eat it. It's semi-interruptible work. If you're flinging a shuttle back and forth, you can stop because the baby's about to climb into the fire or whatever. And it's social as well. So you're not just stuck at home on your own with a baby. So it works. It makes sense for you if you've got kids underfoot for women to be doing that. But now if you think about what happens with industrialization, suddenly textile making, the spinning and the weaving are both done via heavy, expensive industrial machinery, which has to be centralized in a factory. So instead of making textiles in the home, suddenly, even if you're a woman and you want to go on textile making, you've got this decision to face. If you have a breastfed baby at home and suddenly you have to travel some distance away and work a 12-hour shift in a factory, what do? It's a problem that you never had to face before. So this is just one way of illustrating the fact that work and the home separated in a way which actually reduced women's agency at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And it's in a sort of common kind of pop feminist idea is that women were radically disempowered until feminism came along and saved us all at the beginning, and it's sort of was some distance into the modern era. But I've argued that actually relative to, in some respects, the medieval era, women actually lost agency with industrialization. And everything that followed in terms of feminist activism has been in response to that radical disempowerment that happened with industrial modernity. So, and looking at the 19th century, that took two distinctive forms. On the one hand, there were women whose activities at home were now just confined to spending money and looking after kids, who argued that no, actually, the work of the home is good actually, and we need to make sure it's still valued and it's not treated as second class. And this was the so-called cult of domesticity. So you have a proliferation of women's magazines, essentially, most of which are focused on bigging up the domestic work that women do at home. And feminist historians have often framed this as a kind of false consciousness, parroting the tropes of patriarchy in order to accustom women to their subjugation. But another way of looking at it might be that, these are women who recognize that actually caring for children and the work of the home and, defending a space outside the marketplace is important. And the stuff that can't be done within the market, which still matters. And we're trying to make the case for actually that being important and valuable. So in a sense, it was a kind of proto-maternal feminism that's going on in the quote-unquote cult of domesticity. And then against that, you've got women who say, no, actually, we don't want this domestic life. We want to enter the market on the same terms as men. We want to be able to go out into the workplaces where some of the work is now stuff we can do. I want a shot at being a barrister or a doctor. And these tended to be more sort of upper bourgeois women. And so you have this sort of bifurcation of, there are women who push for greater valorization of care, and then there are women who push for women to have personhood, understood as being an atomized market participant on the same terms as men. And these are the two poles of pre-cyborg feminism, which I think of as feminism proper, which is the feminism of freedom and the feminism of care. And there's a huge range of views within those two poles, and the back and forth between them and the negotiation and trying to find a healthy balance between freedom and the needs of dependence is, I think, probably the best characterization you can give of what feminism looked like up until the cyborg revolution.
Before we get to the cyborg, though,
that's a whole.
Well, I'm sure we will. There's also the sexual revolution to consider, which we kind of skipped over.
That is the cyborg revolution.
You did? Oh, that is the cyborg.
That is the cyborg revolution.
Because I thought the cyborg revolution was going to be slightly more recent. But anyway, no. Tell us about the cyborgs.
Well, I mean, I've made the case more starkly since I finished writing Feminism Against Progress. But I realised actually the pithiest way I can say this is to make the claim that the contraceptive pill is the first transhumanist technology. And by that I mean it's the first major widespread social biomedical intervention which aims not at fixing something which has gone wrong with normal health, but upgrading normal, in line with what people want. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you think about what the contraceptive pill does, it actually interrupts normal healthy fertility in the interests of essentially personal freedom. And in that sense, it's a radically different paradigm for what biomedical technologies can and should do. And that obviously, as we know, was legalized and spread like wildfire in the 1960s. And downstream of that came a whole load of other technological transformation. We're a good way further down the path that started. But my argument is that we became cyborgs and women became cyborgs arguably ahead of men at the point where we accepted transhumanist medicine as a basic enabling condition for women's participation in society, which really began in the 1960s. People hope, when they campaigned first for the pill, the hope was that there would be, as a result of the pill, there would be fewer accidental pregnancies, and therefore, it would make women's reproductive choices much more within women's control. But what happened in practice was, well, the absolute number of accidental pregnancies went up, not down, and that was because there was just so much more casual sex happening, because it radically moved the goalposts for what you could or couldn't do. And it's only mostly effective. It's not 100% effective. So there were still enough pregnancies, despite
more. In fact.
The rate of accidental pregnancy went down, but there was so much more sex happening that the absolute number went up. And at that point, it created an inevitable ratchet towards saying, well, what are we going to do about all these accidental pregnancies? Because then it was very difficult to put back in the box. I mean, it was pretty much impossible to put it back in the box. Because people are saying, well, they have the pill now. And everybody's got the pill, and so they're all at it like rabbits. And we can't stop this now. So we have to do something about. This is obviously not a tenable situation. Women are bleeding out in alleyways with coat hangers up them, and this is horrendous. We've got to do something, because they'd opened Pandora's box, and so many of the very strict social controls which had previously obtained around premarital sex were beginning to fall away, and. The case became very compelling to legalize abortion. But of course, once you do that, you're saying that women's autonomy women's autonomy is that much more important than the needs of a dependent, and it doesn't really get much more dependent than an unborn baby that's can't survive outside its mother's body. That you can end the potential life of the dependent in order to safeguard the freedom. So at that point, the feminism of freedom and the feminism of care collided, and history tells us which one won, and that's the world we've been living ever since. And so I think that's the long answer, Francis, to your question of what is feminism. It's the feminism as we understand it today in its mainstream sense is a doctrine which argues that we can and should use technology to the fullest extent possible to flatten the differences between the sexes.
And what's wrong with that?
Even at the expense of unborn lives.
But what's wrong with that?
That's what's wrong with that, I think.
But there's a lot of women who would actually disagree with you, who say, look, I live in a society which is freer than ever. I have more choice than ever before. I can pick a wide range of careers. I can choose when I want to have a child. Surely these are all positive things, Mary?
Yes, but they're not without cost. I entirely agree with you that these are all positives, but they're not cost-free. I think, and that's really what. So that gets us to the end of part one, and part two really is about some of the undercounted costs of the victory of freedom over care when it comes, or rather tech-enabled freedom over care in the domain of feminism. And so I've looked at the war it's been waging on our relationship, on the relations between men and women, on the war it's been waging on the relations between mothers and babies, and finally the war it wages on our relationship with our own bodies.
Flesh those out for us, please.
Okay, so
wrong turn of phrase.
War on relationships. Let's think. How do I characterize this? The point at which you can use technology to flatten the difference between the sexes is the point at which sex leaves the domain of management by social norms and becomes something which is theoretically free. It becomes private. So, I mean, let me back up a little bit. So, if you imagine it's 1910. You know, I'm female. You know, I'm a young woman. I get horny like all humans do, whereas in adolescence. There are very, you know, my mum tells me never be seen alone with a guy. You know, they can get ideas. You know, and you're warned at all. You know, and you're supervised carefully by your aunties and your mum. And this is all with a very pragmatic intent. And it might seem unfair because guys don't get this level of supervision and constraint. But there's a very practical intent behind it, which is that you know, if I get knocked up by mistake with somebody who then disappears on me, it's a problem. You know, it's not just a problem for me. It's a problem for everybody in my immediate family, and it's a problem for wider society. So whether or not it's unfair, the basic asymmetry between the reproductive roles of men and women just forces, you know, a pragmatic response to that at scale. You know, in order to manage the challenge posed to everybody in general by unplanned babies. So there's this intense social pressure from all directions, which is aimed at funneling couples into something like functional dyads, which can raise children together, because it's just the result is just less messy when you do it like that. Then you add the pill into the mix. All of a sudden, all of those rules are theoretically weightless. You don't need them anymore because I can just take this medicine, which means that I can have as much sex as I want. But the thesis I've advanced for what happens at that point is that when, in theory, you know, my sexuality is now my private domain. But what happens at that point isn't just a dividend of freedom, but the market also moves into that space. Because once something belongs just to me, in theory, I can buy or sell it as I see fit. And really, the governing, the common thread to these various wars on relationships is the way that technologies, the intervention of technologies into our bodies, you know, seems to privatize the different facets of our bodies, whether that's our fertility, our sexuality, or even really our embodiment itself. But in practice, what happens then is that becomes commodified. So in the context of sex, the empire of, you know, the porn industry and the sex industry began to mushroom the moment those constraints on sex went away. I mean, you know, the prostitution isn't called the world's oldest industry for nothing. You know, it's always been there, but it absolutely boomed from the 60s onwards. I mean, Hugh Hefner's Playboy and Playboy clubs appeared the same year as the pill was legalized. And by the 1970s, you know, radical feminists were protesting against the endemic and increasingly violent and degrading nature of pornography, which was now just being marketed pretty much openly. Because sexuality was privatized, you know, suddenly there was this libertarian argument for letting women do whatever they wanted with their bodies. Now, in practice, if you speak to a survivor of the sex or the porn industries, they'll tell you that, in fact, there's a great deal more coercion that goes into that than the libertarian arguments might like to believe. But fundamentally, you know, this is the pattern that I wanted to sketch out, is that it's impossible to separate liberation from commodification. And the same goes as well for the fertility industry, which is to say the moment in theory I can control my fertility, it becomes theoretically possible to commodify my fertility. So if you fast forward a number of decades on from the arrival of the pill, we're a long way down that path. I mean, we have young women who've been rendered infertile by selling their eggs in order to pay for college tuition. We have I'm sure you saw the headlines when the war in Ukraine began of these Ukrainian surrogates. It's a big industry over there. Impoverished young women in the Ukraine who essentially rent their wombs to wealthy Westerners who either don't want to gestate themselves or don't have a uterus between them or for whatever reason. And all these babies
who, by the way, have postponed having children to the point where they're physically unable, precisely because of the society we now have.
Precisely because of that. And all these babies, lined up in rows in bomb shelters without motherless babies essentially. And their gestational surrogates have left, and then they're just sort of being cared for under kind of semi-factory conditions by a couple of nurses with the bombs falling overhead. Just astonishingly dystopian images. Which is again what you begin to see once you privatize something which was previously governed by social norms. And finally, in the same context, I've argued that the technologies which enable us to flatten the differences between the sexes, fundamentally, beginning with the pill and abortion, are in logical continuity with the technologies now being employed by transgender identified people to become, as they see it, their true selves, in ways which use technology to flatten the differences between the sexes or to remodel secondary sex characteristics in line with their preferred felt sense of self. So really, I mean, I'm very straightforwardly, I'm arguing that you couldn't have trans people without the pill and abortion, and that and any coherent critique of trans identity has to begin with a coherent critique of what the pill does. Because fundamentally, if you're going to say women are allowed to emancipate ourselves by getting rid of what makes us, by using technology to flatten what makes us distinctively female, why shouldn't other people become more fully themselves using technologies to flatten what make them distinctively themselves? Why shouldn't we just take that a little bit further and just remodel ourselves as we see fit? If you're bought into the cyborg feminist paradigm, trans activism is absolutely in logical continuity with it. Now we're seeing a growing body of young women who are just saying, I don't want this, and who are embracing, less invasive, less psychoactive, non-hormonal contraception or just cycle tracking. And my argument is that this is just where we have to start here. Don't take the pill. Don't encourage your friends to take the pill. Reject this idea that you can't be a person unless you make sort of radically psychoactive cyborg interventions in your own body. And there are a number of things that follow from that in terms of how you relate to men and to your own sexuality. And one of them is that of necessity you become choosier about who you sleep with, which from women's point of view, when you think about hookup culture, is obviously beneficial, because one of the things that women complain about is ending up basically consenting to loveless or degrading sex because there's no obvious reason to say no. And if you sort of neutered yourself sexually by taking this medicine, there sort of is no reason to say no, and sometimes it might just seem politer to put out, which is a pretty kind of grim position to be in if you're a woman. And I think privately, a lot of what flew under the Me Too banner was basically this. There's young women who assented to things sort of out of politeness or found themselves railroaded into sexual encounters, more or less out of politeness, that they couldn't say no to, or didn't have a robust enough reason to say no to because they were already contracepted. And if you're in a situation where there's a meaningful risk of pregnancy, that's a pretty solid motivation for saying no. Actually, I'm not coming home with you, or no, now I'm here. We're not doing this. And it's also, for all but the most, straight out toe rag, it's a fairly robust reason as a guy to not go there as well. Feel like I'm not on birth control and I'm not going to use birth control. It would take a fairly serious scumbag. Anyway, so it reduces the opportunity for bad sex, which I think is obviously in women's interests. It also makes sex better. If you're speaking as a woman, I'm not going to give you grisly details, and I'm too old and ugly to be talking about this stuff anyway. But if you're in tune with your own cycles, it's just nicer. You know where you are, and there are certain kind of moods go up and down over the course of a month in ways which are interrupted if you're on the pill. But I think one of the and taking that a little bit further, it's my view that you can't have the intensity and the mystery and the beauty of a sexual encounter without the danger. Fundamentally, we take sex seriously, or have historically taken sex seriously, because there's the potential of creating another human. And once you take that out of the picture, something strange happens to the entire field of sexuality. And again, I can't prove this because it's just a hunch, but I'm willing to bet that if contraception was no longer part of the picture, most of the cultural interest in BDSM would go away. Most of the choking, most of the role playing, most of the other ways that people look to put the danger and the intensity in to a sexual encounter, which has been sort of neutralized. It's kind of vegan bacon equivalent of the sexual encounter. It's almost the same, but not quite. And so you have to add more hot sauce. And that's where you get all of these, escalating levels of degrading, disgusting kind of kink and extremities. People are trying to add the hot sauce back into something which is fundamentally vegan bacon. And the obvious solution, if you're starting to get inured to the hot sauce, is have the bacon. But that means you put the danger back in. And I call this. I don't think of this as a purity-based argument against contraception. I think of it more as rewilding sex. And when you in an ecological context, when you talk about rewilding, that means sometimes introducing apex predators back into an environment. I don't know if you've seen that amazing viral video about what happened when they introduced wolves back into Yellowstone, and it had all of these incredibly complex effects on the ecosystem, which ended up with a river changing course, because the deer followed different patterns, and then other things happened in a different pattern, and eventually things righted themselves in a whole ecosystem which had been going slightly wrong before, and it couldn't have happened without the apex predator back in. So I've used that as an analogy for thinking about how we can correct some of the things which have gone wrong in our sexual ecology by reintroducing the danger and the intensity. This is a risky argument to be making. I feel like I'm on genuinely heretical territory here, but essentially I'm making the pro-sex case against contraception.